the nuclear umbrella with which we protect the North, the Far East. And there is some concern that if the president agrees to that, that it lifts the umbrella, lifts the shield with which we promise to protect South Korea and Japan.
Yeah, Chris, in the minute that I have left with you, I thought it was fascinating. I was reading today about something that's called Pyonghatan, which is the growing small elite that exists in North Korea. And that the members of that growing small elite are allowed to have certain kinds of commercial enterprise, selling noodles, renting your apartment to someone if you like, sort of baby steps towards what we consider to be, capitalist commerce. And that keeping these folks happy in North Korea is something that's become increasingly difficult for Kim Jong-un. He just fired a bunch of his military leadership, and these people apparently are the ones that perhaps he feels he has to answer to in all of this.
Well, that's exactly right, to the degree that a totalitarian dictator has to answer to anybody. But it's exactly right. There are two components to this from Kim's point of view. One, yes, he wants security guarantees and he wants a military stand down. You can see the delegation starting to come out of the St. Regis Hotel. But he also wants economic relief. That doesn't necessarily mean he wants McDonald's on every corner, but he wants a release of the sanctions so that he is able, as you say, to improve the lives of people in his country. Some economic boost. And that's one of the things the president is talking about. And I suspect it's one of the reasons that Kim is here in Singapore this morning.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the dynamic in North Korea is being pressured to change, and that the status quo is simply not a possibility, whether they come to an agreement here or not. Fascinating to watch this delegation as it gets in place. Chris will be with you throughout the coverage. Thank you so much. The story continues and it goes on with Tucker Carlson in D.C.
This is a Fox News alert. After months of negotiations, insulting nicknames, aggressive tweets, and a brief cancellation, the moment has finally come tonight, right now. President Trump is about to hold a summit in Singapore with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. What can we expect to happen once that starts? Fox Chief National Correspondent Ed Henry is in Singapore right now covering this. He joins us tonight. Hey, Ed.
Tucker, good to see you. There's some movement we're seeing right now at the hotel across town from where I am in Singapore at Kim Jong-un's hotel. He's staying at the St. Regis. There's some military folks who are starting to move as if they're getting his motorcade ready. President Trump's motorcade not in formation just yet, but we are less than 1 hour away from these two leaders meeting. The stakes could not be higher. It was mere months ago that, in fact, President Trump was warning of fire and fury that he might unleash to respond to the fact that U.S. intelligence officials had ascertained that North Korea was closing in on miniaturizing nuclear warheads that could be attached to missiles that could reach the continental United States. Nothing bigger than that. Tonight, though, here in Singapore, optimism in the air that a deal might be reached. The president saying he's on a mission of peace, a much different tone than what I was talking about for months ago. Now, the president a short time ago tweeted meetings between staff and representatives going well and quickly, but in the end, that doesn't matter. We will all know soon whether or not a real deal, unlike those of the past, can happen. Now, that tweet was aimed in part that back in the United States, there's been a lot of heavy criticism of this president, suggesting that maybe a deal is falling apart after Kim Jong-un's aides told White House staff that the dictator is planning to leave Singapore just a few hours from now after the summit kicks off, while the president had left open the possibility of staying another day, having a second day to the summit. He's now reacted by saying he plans to head back to the U.S. rather quickly as well, just a few hours from now after the meetings happen and then the president has a news conference. It starts with a 45-minute one-on-one meeting between the president and Chairman Kim. Just the two leaders, no staff at all, just interpreters so they can communicate. Then 10 p.m. Eastern time, this meeting expands to include the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Remember, he's already met with Kim Jong-un face-to-face twice before. John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, the retired Marine General, and National Security Advisor John Bolton. Then at 11:30 p.m. Eastern time, more White House staff join, more diplomats join, so that both sides can have a working lunch. Kim seemed very loose in the hours leading up to this. Kim Jong-un taking selfies, touring various tourism spots here in Singapore, including a casino, perhaps maybe getting an idea of what loosening of economic sanctions could mean for his economy back in North Korea, looking at the economy here in Singapore. But Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, insisted today that the U.S. is not going to loosen any sanctions until Kim Jong-un at this table less than an hour from now starts to agree to denuclearize. Now, for all the naysayers that I mentioned back home that the president is this last couple hours tweeting about, think about how far we've come. It was just last August that Guam was on a high state of alert. We have U.S. military personnel and their families there. North Korean officials were threatening that they were going to send medium or long-range missiles to attack Guam, go after Americans, and perhaps start a nuclear war. Tonight, Tucker, we are literally less than 1 hour away from the start, at least the start, of peace talks, Tucker.
Ed Henry live for us in Singapore. Thanks a lot, Ed. Well, the summit that starts in less than an hour does not mean that the crisis on the Korean Peninsula will be resolved immediately. Both the U.S. and North Korea have agendas. What are they exactly? George Friedman is the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. Harry Kazianis is director of defense studies at the Center for National Interest, and they both join us tonight. So, in turn, George, first to you, what must the U.S. get out of this? What is the goal of the administration going in?
Well, the obvious goal is getting rid of the nuclear weapons and a very robust inspection regime where inspectors, American inspectors, I expect, can go there and see for themselves what's going on. That's a bottom line. I don't think the United States can back off it.
Harry, that has got to be very different from what the North Koreans expect to get out of this, I assume.
Yeah, no, Tucker. I mean, there's no way that the North Koreans are ever going to agree to what everybody's calling CVID. In other words, the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. It's not going to happen. And history tells us that. I mean, let's face it, North Korea and good news just don't mix. The North Koreans, up until this point, they've made very vague, aspirational pledges to get rid of their nuclear weapons, but they've never been willing to put a date on it. They've never been willing to say that international inspectors would go in. And I think this is a Hail Mary on the part of the Trump administration. I would do the same thing. But what I think Trump needs to do here is to really take a firm line, Tucker. I think he should go into the meeting. I think he should talk to Kim Jong-un, have a little bit of chit chat and then say, look, do you want to get rid of your nuclear weapons or not? If so, let's put out a joint statement. Let's stay here a little longer. Let's try to work it out. If the answer is no, I think Trump should leave. That doesn't mean they can't keep talking. But I really don't think we should keep giving Kim Jong-un a propaganda victory.
So what's, George Friedman, if you're the North Koreans, what is the point of this? He rarely leaves his country. They made a big effort. Clearly they have a goal in mind. What do you think it is?
I think the North Koreans would give up their nuclear weapons, but the price would be staggering. They want U.S. forces out of South Korea. That's what they mean when they say we should have a peace treaty. They say they want the U.S. to withdraw its nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. I'm not sure what that means, but what they're really saying is they want the United States to back off the Northwest Pacific. And that's something the United States can't give, partly because the Japanese would go ballistic, not a joke, and also because of South Koreans. So yeah, I think there are, I don't think that they want to have a nuclear war in any way, but they want to use this as a bargaining tool to reshape the strategic reality in the region, and the U.S. just can't give that.
So I just want to interrupt and say that we have confirmed that the president is in the motorcade and headed to the summit. He's tweeting apparently from the motorcade, and his recent tweet speaks to a Supreme Court decision on voting rights, which he has lauded. So, Harry, what's likely to come out of this then? If each side has a completely different agenda, it doesn't seem like there's a ton of overlap between them. What do you think the likely outcome is?
I think the likely outcome, Tucker, is I think both sides are going to keep talking. Even if Trump did walk out of the room, that doesn't mean that Mike Pompeo still can't go back to Pyongyang. Doesn't mean officials can still keep trying to figure out a way to really sort this out. But I think we really need to look at the bottom line and how North Korea views nuclear weapons. The North Koreans have nuclear weapons in their constitution. They literally bake cakes of their missiles and have them hit diplomatic parties. It's on their stamps. I mean, we would be asking the North Koreans diplomatically to say, essentially cut off their right arm. They're not going to do that. But I think we need to really start thinking about, Tucker, is what does it look like the day after? Because if the North Koreans aren't going to give up their nuclear weapons, we need to start thinking strategically of what that means. That doesn't mean war or regime change. I think we all know, anybody rationally who's looked at that knows that that's impossible. But we need to start thinking about, what does maximum pressure 2.0 look like? How can we contain the North Koreans? I think that's really what we need to start talking about if this does not work.
I should note, you said no one rational wants war with North Korea. Lindsey Graham, maybe not surprisingly, is pushing that tonight. George, what's the Chinese role in this? I mean, presumably the North Koreans wouldn't have done this without permission of, agreement of the Chinese government. Why are they behind this?
The Chinese have been using the North Koreans for a very long time in their own diplomatic forays. Whenever the United States has placed extensive pressure on trade issues or other issues, and North Koreans have done something unseemly, to put it least, the U.S. has reached out to China to do something about North Korea. And that's how this crisis started. But look, the Chinese would love nothing better to see the United States bogged down in some military action in the Korean Peninsula. Or they would love the United States to capitulate and leave the North Koreans be. In either case, they can point out how weak the United States is or how brutal the United States is. But I think one of the things we've learned in this is don't count on the Chinese to be the ones to solve the problem. And I don't think it's because they lack influence in North Korea. Obviously they have it, but they don't want to use it. They were quite happy to see the United States bogged down in this. If I were the Chinese, I would be too. But what we've learned in this is don't count on the Chinese. They're not going to solve the problem.
No, of course. Harry, does the rest of the world want Korean reunification?
I think that's an interesting question. I know the Chinese don't want that because they don't want in 20 or 30 years a powerful Korea that has factories that could be fueled by cheap North Korean labor, meshed with a South Korea that builds things like Samsung Galaxy phones and has, incredible technological prowess. I don't think that the Chinese or a lot of countries probably in East Asia want that. I think eventually it probably will happen. How that happens, I think, is one of the most interesting questions in foreign policy today. I mean, look, if North Korea collapses, we're talking of a situation where, we might have, Tucker, 60 nuclear weapons that are loose. We could have 5,000 tons of chemical weapons that we don't know where they are. So, a staged sort of unification would be a great thing, but even that would be incredibly challenging. I've read different reports where it could cost as much as $10 trillion to integrate South Korea and North Korea and take, 20 or 30 years. So I think it's possible, but it makes this challenge look easy compared to, reunification would just be very, very difficult.
George Friedman, should the United States want reunification?
I don't think it benefits the United States. Our ally, Japan, would be horrified at that. It sees North Korea as a potential adversary. It occupied it before World War II. They don't want it. The Chinese may or may not want it to the extent they can control it. And I agree that they're likely to oppose it. But look, this is a regime to survive what nobody thought it would. When the Soviet Union fell, followed by years of starvation, dysfunction, everybody was waiting for the North Koreans to go down. They didn't. This is a robust regime. Not a nice regime, but a robust regime in the sense that it is well policed by the leadership and it polices the country very well. And this regime, one of the most important things they want is to survive as a regime. One of the reasons, among several, they've built their nuclear weapons is to guarantee that no outside force is going to come in and destabilize or undermine the regime. They haven't survived for the past 20 years to be taken down. So I think the real animosity toward a unification is actually North Korea. South Korea, as I said, doesn't want to pay the bill for North Korean unification. And North Korea knows that if they unify, the regime goes down. And these guys are very happy with their lives running in North Korea.
They have a strong self-preservation instinct. We should note that this is the president's motorcade, our president's motorcade. President Trump is apparently early to the summit. Kim has not left his hotel yet. Gentlemen, if you'll stick around throughout the evening, I appreciate it. We're going to go down to Mark Stein, who's been watching this unfold. Mark, you there?
Yes, I am, Tucker.
What do you make of this? I mean, this is not, if you had to make a list of predictions 2 years ago, this would not be on it, I assume.
No, but President Trump does things differently. This is a kind of upside-down summit, in a way. It's going to start with him and Kim just in the room together with no one but translators. That's really the opposite of the way almost any international gathering takes place. You know the term, I think Churchill coined it, Sherpas, the people who map out everything the summit's going to agree, and then when 88% has been set in stone, then the leaders come in and basically put their imprimatur on this. This is completely the opposite. Donald Trump is going to walk into that room and he's going to make his own calculation as to whether Kim Jong-un is there in good faith. And it's basically going to be the president who calls it and decides whether or not this process is sincere and it's for real. And that's very different from the way almost any other international summitry takes place in the modern world.
What do you make of this? Is that, by the way, we're watching now the president's motorcade in Singapore going to the summit site. What do you make of the way this came about? I mean, I don't think there was anyone who predicted this. And it came out of the president's kind of signature bellicosity, which supposedly gets you nothing, but in this case did get us something.
Yeah, and I actually think that's one of the most effective things. You know, the weakness of the Western world generally is that when we enter into talks or talks about talks, these third world dictators always understand that our priority is to be in a room, sitting down, talking, and getting an agreement. And we'll do almost anything to get into a room and start chit-chatting and having tea and coffee and cookies with the third world dictator. The Iranians understood that, for example, in their negotiations for years with Europe and then with the Obama administration. And this is the complete opposite. Trump's signature style was basically to go metaphorically nuclear on the Pyongyang regime, and then when it was clear that he wasn't like Obama and other Western leaders, to offer the carrot of negotiation. And then just when, you know, Kim was getting cocky, and he decided to start trashing Mike Pence and John Bolton and all the rest of it, at that point, Trump yanked the rug out from under him. So this is a very different style. And in a sense, the House-trained Western leader is behaving as unpredictably as the third world basket case guy. And that's a completely different style of negotiation.
Whose motorcade, by the way, we're just watching pass by. We saw it a second ago. They're heading to Sentosa, which apparently is Sanskrit for peace. There it is right there. This is a man who does not leave his country very often. I think since returning home from boarding school in Switzerland, he's left only a couple of times, once recently to China by armored train. Kind of remarkable that he's left North Korea to come to Singapore for this. What do you suppose he hopes to get out of it?
Well, you know, I thought it was very interesting when he was touring that casino last night. He's actually getting a glimpse of what almost every, I mean, Singapore is spectacularly successful, has one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. If you're an old school imperialist like me, you think that's all down to Sir Stamford Raffles. And if you're of more recent vintage, you think it was Lee Kuan Yew who's done it since 1963. But whoever you give it credit to, Singapore is a hugely successful society. And so when a dictator of a basket case, of a country with barely detectable GDP that makes nothing that anybody needs except cheap knockoff Viagra, and which I hope performs rather better than their nuclear weapons do. But that guy is getting a glimpse of how modern societies work. And the invitation to him really is to say, we'll overlook the fact that you killed all these people, you've starved all these people, and the carrot for you is that your society could be like every other society in that corner of the world. It could be hugely successful, and you would live better, because even dictators live badly in dysfunctional societies.
That's right.
You know, the electrical supply in the presidential palace in Pyongyang isn't more reliable than the electrical supply anywhere else.
What do you think he thinks when he lands in a Chinese 747 in Singapore and looks around? Do you think it shakes his faith in the Marxism he professes to believe in?
I don't know that he does. Well, I mean, this is the interesting question. I don't think this guy is a madman. And I don't think hereditary dictatorships survive over 3 generations without having a strong sense of self-preservation. But the self-preservation is more important than any ideological commitment. I mean, basically, Marxism, as Karl Marx developed it in the 19th century, was supposed to improve the lives of the proletariat. In the modern era, for people like Kim, it's the way of controlling the proletariat. You can't control them if you have a free market society in which people are allowed to live lives that fulfill their potential. So he's not a Marxist. He's not a Marxist in the sense of an economic theory. He's a communist dictator, because that's the way you control people, and that's all it is. And when he's looking at Singapore, the question is whether he can make the leap of imagination. He doesn't have to look that far. He can look at South Korea, but he's actually walking around in what a functioning society looks like. That's what he was doing last night. And that for him is a first. It's not like, you know, it's different from Switzerland because it's closer to home. And they did it in even less time. Now, as I said, I think Singapore has a lot to do with Stanford Raffles and all that. But if you happen to think it's all to do with Lee Kuan Yew, Lee did that in less time. He's done it in, what is it now, 55 years. So he's actually built that society, built modern Singapore in less time than the Kims have driven North Korea, because they've been running that now for an extra, whatever it is, 10 years on that. They've actually driven that joint into the ground. This is what you can do if you're actually building a society.
The first thing that Lee Kuan Yew did was eliminate corruption, though, which might be a stumbling block for the Kim regime.
That's true.
Mark, will you stay with us? We're going to be in rolling coverage for the next hour, if you would. We're going to go down to Nigel Farage, who's standing by, I think, in London. Nigel, you there?
Yes, I am.
What does the rest of the world make of this? This has never happened before. Trump is doing it. A lot of European leaders detest Trump. So how do they square that?
Well, they're confused. I mean, they're still talking about G7, of course, and they're all condemning Trump for his behaviour. Although, of course, failing to notice that the Italians, this new regime in Rome, got a bit closer to America over the weekend. So it's mostly criticism. And the BBC this morning was running with the line that Trump goes into this summit ill-prepared, and they almost met with incredulity at the idea that the initial meeting between Trump and Kim will not be minuted. So what you've got here is you've got media expecting this summit to run the way that other global summits have done for decades. And of course, they just don't understand. Trump does things differently. In fact, if it wasn't for the very basis that Trump does everything in his own style, this meeting wouldn't even be happening, and they don't understand it.
Well, that kind of is the point. I mean, so it's not really possible for your European leaders to say, well, we've conducted our summits with the Kim family more effectively, because they haven't had any.
No.
Do they pause and ask themselves, well, how did Trump pull this off and we couldn't?
Well, they just don't get Trump, do they? You know, what's happened over the last few decades is global leaders have all become roughly the same. There's been a consensus on virtually everything, a desire to govern much of our lives at a higher level than the nation state. That's what they're all subscribed to. They don't like Trump. They don't comprehend Trump. But of course, nobody is wishing him ill for this meeting today, at least nobody in Europe. I have heard some in America kind of saying, look, he's not really fit, he's not intelligent enough. I mean, surely everybody at this moment, everybody, regardless of their view of Trump, should be wishing him and Kim Jong-un the very best of luck. Because at the end of this, if this goes well, if trust is built, if there is a rapport of some kind between the two men, it's not about whether Trump wins, it's not about whether Kim wins, it's about whether the world wins.
I'm not reading European media every day. You, of course, are marinating in it. But in the coverage of the G7, and, of course, the contretemps between President Trump and Angela Merkel widely covered, did anyone note that Angela Merkel destroyed Europe and that should be held accountable for that as well, or was it all Trump is terrible?
No, it's all Trump is terrible, and nobody dares criticize Angela. But you may have noticed in the last 48 hours, the new Italian government have turned back boats coming across from Libya, people being trafficked, you know, across the Mediterranean. It's been going on now for some years. Thousands of people have drowned. Places like Italy are flooded with 500,000 illegal immigrants that are there. And you know, the days of Merkel are numbered, and that's what G7 said to me.
But so why, it's interesting you said nobody dares criticize Merkel. It's hard to think of a more destructive leader in modern European history. Why would people not feel they could criticize her?
Because the European project has been all about solidarity, which means we all agree on everything, we're all nice to each other. But I have to say, I'm actually very grateful to Angela Merkel. I think her decision to open up the borders in the way that she did, without being able to security check a single person, was a major contributory factor to Brexit. So I should be grateful to her for the rest of my life.
That's a good point. Has anybody outside of UKIP, the party that you helped start, or outside of Great Britain, note that? Is that sort of commonly understood, that she's unleashed forces that, you know, our grandchildren will be dealing with?
Oh, very much so. And I mean, Viktor Orban, who very recently won the elections in Hungary with a massive majority in parliament, you know, Viktor Orban says, we will make our own decisions in Hungary about who comes to live here. We will not pay the price for Mrs. Merkel's mistakes, and that was a major factor in Hungary. And if you listen to what Matteo Salvini, the leader of the League in Italy, and they're the party very much in the ascendancy there at the moment, again he says, we're not going to live in a Europe where the Germans make the big decisions that affect our lives. So actually, you can see this show of solidarity with Macron, with Mrs. May, the increasingly weak British Prime Minister. You can see these big displays, but the reality is that politics in Europe is changing, and that Mrs. Merkel has done more to wake people up to the risks of uncontrolled immigration than anybody in history.
That's a very good point. We're at the end of something, at the beginning of something new.
Yes.
Nigel Farage, thank you, as always. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Before traveling to Singapore for the North Korean summit, the president made a stop in Canada for a meeting of the G7. While he was there, he struck an adversarial posture on trade matters, much to the annoyance of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The press, of course, would never dare root for America or an American in an international dispute. Of course not. So they quickly condemned the president's behavior. They warned that he may have hurt the feelings of the other leaders who are apparently very fragile. Watch.
Donald Trump has insulted Justin Trudeau of Canada, called him weak, attacking our allies, sort of ridiculing them.
It's an extraordinary photo, and it doesn't make President Trump look very good. And that may be one reason why he's lashing out at Germany now.
Insulting Germany, insulting Justin Trudeau, calling everybody by first names, by the way, too, which is sort of undiplomatic.
I don't know if he is threatened by Justin Trudeau being younger. I have no idea.
Is it his youth? Is it the fact that I'm told he's a pretty good-looking guy?
Richard Goodstein advised both Bill and Hillary Clinton's presidential campaigns. He joins us now. Richard, by the way, I should tell our viewers that the motorcade we just saw passing was that of Kim Jong-un. There it is right there. So thanks a lot for coming on tonight. Sure. So the president tweeted out that Canada erects massive tariffs against American dairy, among other things. 270% on milk. Turns out it's almost 300% on butter. That's true. And so why would it be somehow wrong for an American president to stand up for an American industry in an international meeting?
Right. You know, I've been listening to your coverage all night, of course, and, you know, this all makes sense if you believe that up is down and down is up. I mean, that no preparation for a meeting like this one is good, and knowing what drives a leader or a country is somehow a fool's errand and a waste of time that lesser people do. Look, it only makes sense, Tucker, to criticize our allies and elevate dictators like Putin, or even now to call Kim Jong-un a honorable man. This is crazy, right? And to walk away 2 hours after he said, I'm committed to something, to say, I don't want to do it. That's not how the United States can conduct ourselves and have anybody, friend or foe alike, believe what we say.
So here's what, look, here's what I think the president does understand, and I agree with you. He's not a detail man. But he understands that leaders act in their own interest. They don't act out of pique or hurt feelings. They act out of what they think is good for them and the countries they lead. And so if we could just go back very quickly to the G7, then I do want to address what you said about North Korea. Why did it infuriate American liberals when the president stood up for American interests? And of course, the answer is because they don't like America. But I want to hear your version of that answer.
Yeah, of course, that's silly. Look, it infuriated everybody,
silly.
Not
it's
just
demonstrable
liberals.
in everything they say.
There are, if you gave a truth serum to every Republican in the Senate and House, a huge percentage of them would say they're embarrassed to have a president of the United States call our allies
I'm sure they
the
are.
kind of names.
But
yes,
that means
exactly.
nothing to me. You always,
I understand it means
because
nothing to you.
I don't care what some politician thinks. I'm interested in the principle, and that is, why is it wrong for an American leader to stand up for American interests? There are, despite NAFTA, enormous tariffs against certain American exports. That's why we have a trade deficit with Canada.
He should stand up for American interests.
The president said that, and American liberals are like, oh, you're being mean to Justin Trudeau. He's so hunky. Stop.
No. Where people, again, it wasn't just liberals. What they reacted to is Justin Trudeau said before that press conference at the end of the G7, as he did afterwards, that he too was going to stand up and retaliate against these unfair tariffs on aluminum and steel, right? That's all he said. So somehow that became the thing that Trump was going to, you know, kind of put his pick in the ground about and walk away from the very deal that he agreed to hours before. If the United States president can't be trusted to stand by his word, what then? I mean, how in the world can Kim Jong-un...
Because we've had... Wait, hold on, slow down. We've had a succession of presidents for my entire lifetime, almost all of whom were well respected, and sort of, you know, all the chin tuggers thought they were great. They were very thoughtful. And they allowed this country to get shafted. They allowed China into the WTO and lost millions of American jobs. Millions. We've never recovered from that. We have not recovered. And yet the people who did that, George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, are considered heroes and statesmen. I'm confused by the standards by which you're judging leaders. Shouldn't we judge leaders by how they do for their people?
Yeah, of course. Look, we've lost most of the jobs we've lost to automation. The same reason we've lost coal industry jobs.
That's not true.
I'm not. Look,
that's not true. We lost the entrance into the WTO. Destroyed American manufacturing.
Yeah, I think China has not lived up to its commitments in the WTO. There will be no dispute from me or, frankly, most other people about whether China is...
But nobody says anything about it. And all the Morning Joe is totally cool with that. As long as you just sort of let it happen and don't make a fuss, it's totally fine. You're one of us. You probably are on the CFR. But the second somebody says anything about it, oh, you're totally irresponsible. Why shouldn't an American leader stand up for America? Really simple question.
The problem is they should, but China is the problem as regards, say, aluminum and steel, not Canada. That's the problem, and not Japan and not France. And yet the president seems perfectly hunky-dory to look the other way when it comes to ZTE and these Chinese behemoths that are basically insinuating themselves into U.S. technology, and somehow or other it's Canada that becomes the enemy as regards trade. We've got stuff moving back and forth.
Look, I don't think Canada is the enemy. I just think it's an acknowledgement that each country has its own set of interests, and it pursues those. And in some cases, they're different from ours, and we should push back. Let me ask you, though, of course, the press being stupid reduces everything to the personal. So Trudeau is mad at Trump. Trump is mad at Trudeau. At this exact moment, the president of South Africa, who is an open and avowed racist, who has pledged to take people's land away based on their skin color, I think you'd agree that meets the definition of racism, was with Trudeau, and Trudeau issued this long statement about how great he is. Ramaphosa, you're fantastic, wonderful to have you here. Do you find it a little striking that the president of South Africa is accorded more respect than our own, not just by Trudeau, but by American liberals? Do you think it's weird?
That is weird. What's weirder is having the United States president stand up for Russia after they invade Crimea, after they engage in war crimes, after they meddle in the U.S. elections to help him, that they want to elevate the Russians, an economy that's as small as Spain, to the G7. As it was said in some of these tweets over the weekend, Angela Merkel looking at Trump and seeming to say, what does Putin have on you? We can help you. Just let us know. Because that's the only explanation
have on
for
you.
Trump's behavior.
Do you think, I mean, Russia, why is Russia, and this is a sincere question, at the center of the liberal mind? If you consider all the countries around the world that are murdering minority groups within their borders, invading other countries, posing a nuclear threat to our country, exporting terror, Russia is not even close to the top of the list of threats to the United States. And yet, in the view of liberals, it's all about Russia. I mean, I honestly think it's a psychiatric disorder, but maybe there's another explanation.
Well, unless you can include Donald Trump as the liberal mind, he's the one who's talking about bringing Russia back into the G7. He's the one who's talking about
why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Because Russia violated human rights abroad? Is that what you're saying? Like, why wouldn't? When he's meeting with the president of North Korea, speaking of human rights violations, who maintains gulags where hundreds of thousands of families languish and die, but we're meeting with him anyway. Why wouldn't you want to meet with your opponents, with your adversaries? Liberals always used to argue that. And now bringing Russia into the G7 is like immoral for some reason? I'm totally confused.
Well, remember, it used to be the G8. Russia was in it until it attacked another country.
Until recently.
Right, until it basically took over territory of another country. Again, I know you don't care who's a Republican senator or congressman.
Around the world every day.
Well, the fact is, we don't honor that. We basically, I think
because China invaded Tibet. China is rounding up Muslims right now and putting them in concentration camps. But we put them into the WTO and allowed them to destroy our economy.
Right.
Half the population of Washington, D.C. takes money from them. As you know, every think tank, every lobbying organization, all take money from the communist government of China, which is invading its neighbors, oppressing minority groups, and nobody says anything about it, and spying on us. Why do you think that is? Why does nobody say anything? It's kind of weird, isn't it?
I think China should be called out for every transgression that it engages in. It just seems weird.
So how about anyone in D.C. taking Chinese money? Should they be indicted? I mean, don't you think? I mean, given what they're doing?
You asked what was weird and what was in the liberal mind, and all I'm saying is for Donald Trump to stand up time after time after time for Russia seems bizarre, unexplainable, but for the fact that there's something.
I mean, honestly, who cares? By the way, you're single-handedly making me pro-Russia. I was ambivalent on the subject at first, and now I'm like, they must be pretty great if the left hates them this much. I'm trying not to let myself get on that path.
I don't think it's just the left.
No, it's a holdover. Low IQ Republicans in D.C. feel the same way. I'm aware of that. Yeah. But it's just so disconnected from the reality of the modern world, where Russia, again, is not even in the top tier of threats to the United States. It's almost as if liberals are intentionally moving attention away from the real threats to an irrelevant place like Russia.
Here's a real threat.
Could that be?
Here's a real threat. Undermining the sanctity of our democracy is a very real threat. And the Republicans and Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee, well, the Senate Intelligence Committee, in a bipartisan way, said the Russians meddled to help Trump. That is a absolute blow to our democracy, whether you like it or not.
Let me ask you, do you think, sincerely, do you think Russia did more to undermine the legitimacy of our elections than those politicians who've argued against voter ID laws, which make it impossible to detect voter fraud, which is widespread, and they systematically abet voter fraud? So do you think Russia, Vladimir Putin, or the ACLU has further undermined the sanctity of our elections?
So I think if you had a rank order between Russia, Comey, voter suppression, I think those three are probably pretty high on the list of what tilted the election in Trump's way, since you're asking me. Yes, that's what I think happened. And I think actually, as I said to you before, there wouldn't be billions of dollars spent on ads on Fox News if somebody out there didn't think that that would influence people's opinions. And that's exactly what the Russians did, reaching through Facebook 126 million, only 135
people
million
never
voted.
would. I think you're onto something here. People never would have voted for Trump unless Vladimir Putin told them to. And
it's slightly more complicated, maybe for another time.
Richard, good Steve. I don't think it's more complicated. I think it's exactly what happened. Great to see you.
Sure.
We're going to take a quick break. The summit is, I'm looking at the ticker there, about 23 minutes from now. We'll be back in just a minute and take you all the way to the historic meeting President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. It's never happened before, and we're going to cover it live for you on Fox. Welcome back. We've got a Fox News alert for you. The president has tweeted from Singapore that Larry Kudlow, who's 70, director of the National Economic Council, apparently, according to the president, has had a heart attack and is at Walter Reed Medical Center receiving treatment at this hour. That's all we know. When we find out more, of course, we'll tell you right away. Brett Baer, anchor of Special Report, and our friend is on the scene live in Singapore for us. Hey, Brett, what's going on there?
Well, Tucker, I mean, that was just a real surprise to have the president issue a tweet or send out a tweet with breaking news about Larry Kudlow, and obviously our prayers are for him. He's at Walter Reed, we're told by the president. Don't have any more information. What's happening here is we're moments away from the greeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un at this Capella resort on this island that's kind of separated from downtown Singapore. Both motorcades have arrived, and we're just waiting for any moment the host TV to put out this shot, and there you see it. President Trump, we're told, will come from the right side and Kim Jong-un from the left, and there will be a handshake, which will be probably the most photographed in the world, as you're looking at a picture of Larry Kudlow, still trying to get some information about his status.
The fact that the President of the United States is meeting with Kim Jong-un, the hereditary dictator of North Korea, is really something that nobody would have predicted even 3 months ago. What are the Trump people saying to you about this? Are they shocked by it, exhilarated by it? Do they have high hopes? What do they expect?
Well, they're exhilarated by it. They have expectations, but not high expectations for this first meeting. It sounds more and more as days go on that there may be more meetings, judging by their early meetings with the North Koreans setting this up. I don't think anybody inside or outside the administration thinks that Kim Jong-un is suddenly going to drop everything to get American investment inside North Korea, but it could begin a process where they have seen indications that he is willing to at least talk about it. He really wants this photograph, Tucker. This is Kim Jong-un. President Trump wants concrete results, and the question is whether giving the photograph is going to lead you to the results that you want. It is historic no matter what happens.
So we're looking at, I don't know if you can see them, but pictures of apparently the room where this is going to take place. DPRK flags, North Korean flags, next to American flags, something I don't think anyone's ever seen before. So the president and Kim are meeting alone, apparently, with translators. What happens then?
Well, there's a 45-minute meeting. It's a kind of high-class resort. It's separated from downtown Singapore. Very high security all around here. And the two leaders will come in, they will shake hands, then they will go into a room with just their translators. We're told that's going to last 45 minutes, but there's really no stopwatch. They will talk until they finish talking, and then it'll be opened up to other people inside the room, inside the administration, on the U.S. side and the North Korean side. In that room will be Secretary of State Pompeo, the National Security Advisor John Bolton, the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, and a few others, and then that will continue until a working lunch later on in the day.
No joint press conference, I assume.
Not a joint press conference, but we're told that the president's going to have a press conference or answer questions from the media, have a statement at 4 p.m. this time, 4 a.m. U.S. East Coast time. and then is expected to depart. Now, the White House is careful to say if things are moving and we need to stay, the whole departure is going to be changed. But right now, scheduled to talk to the press, talk to Sean Hannity in an interview, and then leave on Air Force One.
Quite a moment. We're watching history, and you're there. Congrats. Brett Baer, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
I want to bring in Dr. Michael Pillsbury, not an overstatement to say one of the world's great experts on China. Dr. Pillsbury, thanks a lot for coming on. What's China's role in bringing about this summit, and why?
Well, China's played a role because of pressure from President Trump. I think President Trump started this whole operation, very carefully scripted, of maximum pressure through the United Nations. He needed the Chinese to approve those resolutions. They did. The Chinese really changed their approach. They used to be more passive about North Korea, or even mildly embarrassed, let's say. What's begun to happen more recently is to please Trump, and because of his implied pressure on them in various ways, they then pressured, according to Trump's plan and his request, the Chinese then pressured North Korea, not just the sanctions, but when President Trump and his team began to talk about the use of force in very limited military strikes on the nuclear facilities up in the north of North Korea, China did not really take a stand against that. They gave the impression to the North Koreans that they might just stand by and let a military strike be performed on Northern Korea. The third thing the Chinese have done to make this happen, I mean, obviously they provided the airplane, but they've been trying for more than a decade to soften up the hardline Stalinist policies toward the economy in North Korea. They've tried to show North Korean teams of economists, this is how we, China, did it. We're almost surpassing America today in our economy. We used to be poor like you. You could do this. And they've shown them the Chinese model in great detail. And that's had an impact. I think that's one of these three factors all together. The maximum pressure sanctions has crippled the economy, the threats of military force, and then the Chinese say, look, you could be rich like us. Those three together have brought Chairman Kim to Singapore. So we owe China quite a bit. They didn't make this happen completely, but they could have done something very different and protected North Korea, said, don't talk to this man, you know, made it been a real problem for us. They weren't.
I can't get over the fact there's such a thing as a North Korean economist. I didn't know there was a category like that.
Well, so even Stalin had economists.
No, I know he did. A lot of them. So China has, of course, liberalized its economy while retaining an authoritarian management structure, in effect.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Why wouldn't North Korea see that as an appealing model?
Oh, that's what the Chinese hope they'll do, and that's frankly the reason this summit, I think, is such a cliffhanger around the world, is we haven't really heard from young Chairman Kim yet. If he wants to accept what the deal that's been offered to him now for several months of talks in the secret channels, if he wants to accept the offer, we will make you rich. We will really help investment, trade, and everything in North Korea. We'll find out within a few hours, I think. If he doesn't want to accept the offer, then he probably doesn't want to give up his nuclear weapons either. And we're looking at a possible walkout, politely, as President Trump says, a polite walkout taking place in the next few hours. So I think for good reason, this is a cliffhanger. We don't really know for sure what Chairman Kim is going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's only one country that's ever given up its nuclear weapons, South Africa, and it's hard to imagine any country ever doing that. So short of, I mean, if the North Koreans were to say, no, we're not giving up our nuclear weapons, is there any wiggle room for a deal, or is it just over? It's black or white?
I think it's returned to phase two. President Trump has, I think, thought this through. Phase two is much more maximum pressure. He even talked about 300 additional types of sanctions on different products. He's also talked about returning to aggressive military exercises and the possibility even of a military strike. I think you know in one of President Trump's books 18 years ago, he's uncannily predicted, if I were president negotiating with North Korea and they wouldn't agree, he says in this book in the year 2000, He says, I would walk out and then have a military strike on a single target and then resume the talks. So this notion of the use of the threat of force, or even the real use of force, he's already previewed that in the past. This is not, some critics say, you know, he's just a real estate guy from New York. What does he know about nuclear weapons? He actually wrote about this in more than one book. So I think his team has thought it through. You mentioned, Tucker, the South Africa model, we call it. Now, they dismantled their nuclear weapons themselves. They surprised the world by saying, we have 6. We've just dismantled them already. We've taken the highly enriched uranium and distributed it for reactors and other purposes. Now the UN inspectors can come and take a look. That's one model Chairman Kim can think about, rather than have Westerners and Americans go over all of his 40 or 50 or 60 nuclear weapons and with an unfamiliar screwdriver, if you will, try to take them apart. It might be better if the North Koreans, either on their own with an inspection later or with Westerners, dismantle this whole system. He's got a lot of things. He's got plutonium factories. He's got underground, which we don't know where they are. He's got underground uranium enrichment facilities. It's a huge, huge program that nobody even knows the exact cost. So there may be a bill that the U.S. Congress and the UN will have to pay to assist this whole process. But you see how optimistic I am. I mean, I think the walkout is a possibility, but I think more likely is a process will begin in which we'll all learn more about what happened in Libya the first time, which is 2002, when they cooperatively said, okay, we have centrifuges, they're underground, you can put them in boxes, put them on ships, and take them to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. That happened. So there's a third model you didn't mention. It's not really nuclear weapons. It's strategic missiles, more than 100 that the Soviets had deployed in Ukraine. Ukraine said, we'll give them up. But they tried to sell, they tried to put a price on the enriched uranium. They tried to use it as a bargaining chip. Ultimately, it succeeded, but that involved the Secretary of State, President Father Bush, doing a lot of things. So these three models, I think President Trump's team has studied. The South Africa model, the Libyan model, and more importantly, the Ukraine model.
I want to stop you there. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to tell our, I don't know if you can see the screen, our audience. Apparently, we're looking at Kim Jong-un exit the motorcade here.
What's in that briefcase?
Amazing. Yes, he does. It's an astonishing moment, really. No one would have expected this. It's hard to believe we're watching this, in fact. Wow, that's amazing. Michael Pillsbury, the Chinese, of course, are the main patron, I suppose would be the word, of North Korea. But to what extent are they choreographing this, or sponsor? Are they influencing these talks?
Tucker, they've told me a little bit of panic they have, that they want the talks to succeed, but they don't want North Korea to join the American camp. They've got a kind of paranoid view that America is encircling China, and now we're going to add North Korea to completely encircle them. It shows you the kind of paranoid thinking that China still has. But there's something to this, that if North Korea does become a partner of ours over the next few years, it does provide us better access to a part of China we otherwise wouldn't know much about.
That's right. And I think recent history has shown you really can't be too paranoid. Paranoid people are usually right. It turns out. Michael Pillsbury, thank you for your very smart analysis. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
Well, the summit we're watching unfold, it's about to start in fewer than 10 minutes, is really an astonishing development to anyone who remembers the long state of U.S.-North Korea relations. And even just a half a year ago, in 2017, President Trump spoke about North Korea. It was typically to ridicule the regime itself and to warn of the total annihilation if it stepped out of bounds. Watch this.
They will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Do not underestimate us, and do not try us.
Well, that was just a few months ago, remarkably. How do we get from that to what we're watching right now on our screen? Byron York has covered all of it. He's the chief political correspondent at the Washington Examiner, and he joins us tonight. Byron, reverse engineering the long road from there to where we are right now, how much of this was intentional? How much of this unfolded as a plan or a strategy on the part of the administration?
Well, there was a strategy to do something new. I mean, this is so extraordinary because it is a president trying something new. Donald Trump is criticized for virtually everything he does, but he has been perhaps criticized a little less for this because North Korea is a problem that no president has been able to figure out ever before anyway. What was kind of striking, if you go back to the 2016 campaign, for all the time that North Korea has taken in the Trump presidency, it wasn't really a huge thing in the campaign. It wasn't a big thing in the GOP primary debates,
yes,
nor in the general election debate. And I think that what Trump is doing here is something so new because in the campaign, for example, he would criticize and pledge to undo what a previous president had done, like the Iran nuclear deal, or he said he would not engage in foreign adventurism like George W. Bush. But this is something completely new. And now maybe there's a reason it's never been done before. It was a bad idea. We'll find out. But this is a president who was willing to do something different than his predecessors.
Very quickly, since you're part of the press, but you also watch carefully, what do you think of the news coverage of this?
Well, I think that, as I said before, I think it's been a little less negative than a lot of other Trump things because there's a possibility this could work. And so while there's a lot of sort of a natural tendency to poo-poo what Trump does, I mean, this actually might work. I think a little bit of it has gotten caught up in the coverage of the G7 coverage, in which you've had a lot of news commentators suggesting that